Good morning. Please be seated. Going back a century in the field of psychology, we're going to take a little journey back in time to Carl Jung and further back to Freud. I'd like us to remember, at a high level, their studies of the human psyche. They were both focused on the duality of human nature. Freud's focus was on the conscious versus the unconscious actions and mind. And Jung focused on right and reason versus what he called the shadow, or our darker impulses. Hatred, aggression, sadism, selfishness, jealousy, resentment. Things about which Jung believed we can and are ashamed, embarrassed of, try to deny, hide from. Jung believed that these traits are there in each and every one of us, hidden in shadow, often denied. And Jung said that when we ignore that shadow side, when we pretend it's not there, it's easy for those impulses to get out of control, be fed even. And Jung contended that when those impulses take control, it's harder, not impossible, but harder for the reason, the right side of us, to take that control back. But that ability to take back that control, that's the work of civilized people, Jung stated. It's the work of civilized society to reconcile the shadow side and turn from it. Sound familiar? It's sort of taking Jesus' words and making it a little more secular, perhaps. In today's gospel, we have a naked demoniac, this person bound and loosed of bonds by Jesus, transformed. This Jungian way of thinking about our interaction with the world is not theoretical. It's not theoretical. Some examples. Our national political discourse is as base as I've ever seen it. The fostering of violence and some folks finding joy in that violence. I think this is an example of the unconscious psyche responding. It's the shadow side, responding, controlling, and the reasoned right not being actively chosen. A second example, our refusal as a society to seriously address our country's history of systemic racism, dating back to before and clearly exhibited in the events we commemorate this new national holiday, Juneteenth. This refusal to address, to acknowledge, be willing to dive into the depths of the sin of systemic racism is tied to something else that I think of as sinful. And that's the sin of complacency. And I think as an example of complacency, this national holiday that was declared last year or created last year, in 30 states it is not observed because it's not been funded by those state legislatures. And there is a sin of complacency that people in those states aren't berating their state legislatures to fund it and to acknowledge it. It's a step, a necessary step to make this Juneteenth more understood. And it's a step toward addressing systemic racism. This Jungian way of thinking is not theoretical. It's real with horrific consequences when ignored. Abraham Lincoln referred to this as the choice of not listening to our better angels and letting our lesser angels win out. Perhaps that's another image that can help frame this discussion that I'm trying to have with you today. Our gospel today with this demoniac is hitting right on this point of our human nature, this dualistic nature. I think the behavior of the demoniac and townspeople toward Jesus is meant to highlight this dualism. The demoniac, who is saved by Jesus, had some cognizance of who Jesus was and responded to that knowledge by asking for help in the only way he knew how, by approaching Jesus and being pretty rude to him. He could have run away, but he didn't. Juxtaposed against that response is the reaction of the townspeople, who are the antithesis of what we hear in our collect today, where we are called to be rooted in God's loving kindness. The town and the swineherds ask Jesus to leave because we hear they're afraid, but really their livelihood has been destroyed in the curing of that demoniac. And they were probably more than afraid. They were probably kind of angry. The whole town was used to seeing this man living out there in the cemetery. As with so many things in our lives, we can adapt and accept behaviors as normal, which really are not normal in the least. That skewed normalcy of these townspeople allowed them to value more those swine than the well-being of a fellow human who was one of their own. By not addressing those sins I began by talking about, I wonder if our societal culture isn't more like the townspeople than the cured individual, who begs to go along with Jesus and Jesus says no. I wonder if our inability to address systemic racism is rooted in us allowing our shadow side to rule as opposed to the right and the reason. Jesus wants the cured person to be a witness to the world of what God can do for those who ask and are faithful. Jesus says, go home and declare, evangelize how much God has done for you. This cured individual does go home and proclaims throughout the land how much Jesus has done for him. Notice, Jesus said give credit to God, but instead, credit is given by this individual to the one who he cannot identify as God. Our gospel today with this demoniac is hitting right on the point of our human nature, this dualistic nature. God made us this way, with free will to choose. Truly, it's much more complicated than that. I get that. With mental illness and lack of medical treatment and ineffective medications, complicating evaluations and understanding, it's much more complicated than just choice. But some of it is choice. Some of it is. This gospel story of the demoniac truly is a metaphor of choosing right reason over those shadowy, embarrassing impulses. It is a metaphor pushing us to do something, but to do what? One of my favorite parts of our baptismal covenant is the promise to respect the dignity of every human being. I will, with God's help, we reply. But there's a first clause to that baptismal covenant, and it's, will you strive for justice and peace among all people, respecting the dignity of every human being. What strikes me there is strive. Strive. It's an active verb. It's an action, and it's personal. As important as prayer is, action is required. Back to the gospel. This healed demoniac begged to stay with Jesus. Jesus said, you can do more good here. You've been transformed. Go, transform others. Help them to reject their shadow side and live into right and reason. I believe one of the things Jesus is saying by his insistence that the healed demoniac stay is that it is all of our jobs to train, to teach, to empower people and help them learn how to choose right and reason over those more base impulses. We can actively make a difference, living into these lives focused on right and reason, purposefully choosing the opposite of our darker impulses. Instead of aggression, peace. Instead of selfishness, selflessness. Instead of jealousy, joy at others' success. Jealousy, nope, did that one. Greed, compassion and generosity. Hatred, love. Fear, hope. Me, us. We are a me culture. How do we become an us culture? These are active choices that we all can make on a daily basis, thereby living into Jesus' commandments, as we are a people of hope and compassion and joyfulness and peace. We are called by Jesus to make a better world for all of us, not just me, all of us. That's what the reign of God is. It's for all. My hope is that we can help create and live into a world where we update Paul's words in Galatians and that they become true. That there is no gay or straight, no black or brown or white, no lesbian or trans, no Muslim or Christian, no male or female, no learned or unlearned, no rich or poor, but one common humanity, striving to live into the right and reasonable part of ourselves, where every person is given the respect and dignity that Jesus models for us in his life and ministry. These are tangible, palpable things we can do daily, setting a model for others to follow. And this allows us to be salt and leaven and light by which the world can be transformed. Amen.